The Federal Reserve created $4.8 trillion out of thin air since 2008. That's more money than Germany's entire GDP. But here's the crazy part. Who do they owe it to? Nobody knows the real answer, and it's going to blow your mind. If I printed a single $100 bill in my basement, I'd face 20 years in federal prison. But when the Fed creates $120 billion in 1 month, like they did in March 2020, they call it monetary policy. What's really going on here? The numbers are absolutely insane. In 2008, the Fed's balance sheet was $900 billion. By 2022, it exploded to $9 trillion. That's a tenfold increase in just 14 years, more than Japan, Germany, and the UK combined. All created digitally with computer keystrokes. Most people think the Fed prints money like actual printing presses, with Jerome Powell cranking out fresh bills like he's at Kinko's making copies. That's completely wrong. The Fed doesn't print anything. That's the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. They produce $146 billion annually just to replace worn-out bills. The Fed does something different, something far more powerful. They create money digitally with keystrokes on a computer, unlimited amounts. When you create money on a computer, you go to prison. When the Fed does it, it's perfectly legal. The question is why? The answer lies in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act, which gave 12 regional banks special power to issue Federal Reserve notes, what we call dollars. But here's the kicker. These aren't government institutions. They're private banks with special privileges, owned by member banks in each region. JP Morgan owns stock in the New York Fed. Bank of America owns stock in multiple regional Feds based on where they operate. Here's exactly how money creation works, step by step. The Fed doesn't wave a magic wand. They follow open market operations. The Federal Open Market Committee meets with 12 voting members 8 times per year to decide monetary policy. When they want to inject money, maybe Bear Stearns just collapsed like in 2008, or maybe the entire economy shuts down like March 2020, they authorize the New York Fed to begin operations. They don't print cash. They go shopping in the secondary market. But what do they buy? Government bonds, treasury bills, mortgage-backed securities, and during crisis periods, corporate bonds. Basically IOUs from various entities. The numbers get absolutely crazy. During the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed purchased $1.75 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. During the COVID pandemic, they bought $120 billion per month in treasuries and mortgage securities. Every single month, that's $4 billion every day, weekends included. They buy from primary dealers, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and about 24 major financial institutions. But here's the kicker. They pay with money that didn't exist 5 seconds earlier. Goldman Sachs has $10 billion in treasury bonds. The Fed says, we'll buy those at market price. Goldman says, great, where's our $10 billion? AF Fed employee opens the FedWire computers, stem and types. Goldman Sachs account, plus $10 billion? Now the Fed owns $10 billion in government bonds, and Goldman Sachs has $10 billion in fresh cash they can lend out immediately. But who owes who? The Fed owns an asset. The bond pays them interest. Currently, 10-year Treasury bonds pay around 4.5% annually. But they created the purchase money out of thin air. This creates the money multiplier effect. Goldman can now lend out $9 billion while keeping 10% in reserve. When they make loans, they create $9 billion in new deposits, money that didn't exist before the loan was made. Those deposits get redeposited in other banks. 90% of that can be lent again. The cycle continues. The mathematical formula is simple. Total money created equals initial amount divided by reserve requirement. $10 billion divided by 0.10 equals $100 billion possible. The Fed created $10 billion, but the banking system turned it into $100 billion in total money supply through the money multiplier effect. This is where people's brains explode because it seems impossible. But it gets even weirder when you see what happens to all that interest the Fed collects. The Fed now owns $8.9 trillion in government bonds and mortgage securities as of 2023. These bonds pay interest. In fiscal year 2022, the Fed collected $170.8 billion in interest payments. That's nearly $500 million flowing into the Federal Reserve every single day. But here's where your brain melts. Who pays that interest? The U.S. Treasury, the government. The government pays interest to the Fed on money the Fed created from nothing to buy government debt. In 2022, the Treasury paid the Fed $170.8 billion in interest on bonds the Fed bought with created money. It's like lending yourself money, then paying yourself interest. But it's not that simple. Here's the plot twist that changes everything. The Federal Reserve, by law under Section 7 of the Federal Reserve Act, has to return almost all profits to the U.S. Treasury after paying operating expenses and member bank dividends. In 2022, the Fed returned $109.9 billion to the Treasury. In 2021, it was $107.4 billion. Over the past decade, the Fed has returned over $1 trillion to the U.S. government. So let me get this straight. The Fed creates money to buy government bonds. The government pays $170 billion interest on those bonds to the Fed. The Fed keeps $60 billion for operations and bank dividends, then gives $110 billion back to the government. It's the most elaborate circular transaction in human history, but this circle reveals who the Fed really owes money to. The Federal Reserve System consists of 12 regional banks: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Richmond, Atlanta, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Dallas, and San Francisco. Each bank is owned by member banks in their region. These member banks receive a 6% annual dividend on their Fed stock, mandated by law since 1913. In 2022, this amounted to $940 million paid to member banks, nearly $1 billion paid to private banks for owning Fed stock. But here's the thing. Stock ownership doesn't give member banks control over Fed policy. They can't vote on interest rates or quantitative easing decisions. The stock is more like a membership fee that provides certain privileges, including access to Fed services and the discount window for emergency loans. Here's the truth that will rewire your understanding. The Fed does not owe money to anyone in the traditional debt sense. When you borrow $300,000 for a mortgage, you owe it to a specific bank. You have to pay back over 30 years with interest, or they foreclose your house. But when the Fed creates money, they're not borrowing from anyone. They're creating it as an asset on their balance sheet. Think of it like this. If you're a baker and you bake a loaf of bread using flour, water, and yeast, do you owe that bread to someone? No, you created it using inputs you purchased. It becomes your asset. You can sell it, trade it, or eat it. The Fed creates money the same way, but their ingredients are different. Instead of flour and water, they use legal authority granted by Congress and backing of the U.S. government. The money becomes their asset, just like bread becomes yours. But what backs this money? What gives it value? The answer reveals who the Fed really answers to. The money is backed by government bonds they bought with it. Government bonds backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. This means the U.S. government's ability to tax its citizens and pay its debts. In fiscal year 2022, the federal government collected $4.9 trillion in revenue, primarily through income taxes, payroll taxes, and corporate taxes, which means the money is ultimately backed by us, the taxpayers, our labor, productivity, and economic output. So in a weird, circular way, the Fed owes this money to us, not as debt to be repaid, but as a promise that this money has value. The Fed's obligation is to pay back. It's to maintain value and stability through their dual mandate: maximum employment and price stability, codified in the Federal Reserve Reform Act of 1977. The Fed must keep unemployment low and inflation around 2% annually. When they create money, they're making a promise to every dollar holder that they won't create so much it destroys the currency's value. But there's another group with a very different relationship to all this created money. Remember those banks that sold bonds to the Fed? Bank of America, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs? They're sitting pretty now because they turned liquid bonds into highly liquid cash reserves. Cash is far more flexible than bonds. But here's what most miss. Those banks can now lend that cash out through fractional reserve banking. When they lend it out, they create even more money, multiplying the Fed's initial creation by up to 10 times. Here's how with real numbers. Bank of America received $10 billion from the Fed for Treasury bonds. Under current reserve requirements, which are actually 0% for most deposits as of 2020, they can theoretically lend all $10 billion. But let's use the traditional 10% requirement. Bank of America keeps $1 billion in reserve and lends out $9 billion to businesses and consumers. When someone gets a $1 million business loan, Bank of America doesn't give cash from their vault. They create $1 million in new deposits in the borrower's account, money that didn't exist before the loan was made. Those borrowers spend their loan money, which gets deposited in other banks. $9 billion in new deposits spread across the banking system. Each receiving bank keeps $109 billion in new deposits spread across the banking system. Each receiving bank keeps $900 million total and can lend out $8.1 billion. The process repeats. The Fed created $10 billion, but the banking system turned it into up to $100 billion in total money supply through the money multiplier effect. This is why economists distinguish between the monetary base, money the Fed creates, and broader money supply, M1, M2, M3, that includes bank-created money. Now here's the kicker. All those loans banks make, people have to pay back with interest. The average business loan rate in 2023 is around 78%. Credit card debt totals $1.1 trillion nationally and averages 22% interest. Mortgage rates are around 7.5% as of late 2023. So we have interest on money created from nothing, based on Fed money also created from nothing. But interest payments are made with real labor, real goods, and real economic value. Let's follow a specific example. John gets a $500,000 mortgage at 7.5% interest over 30 years. His total payments will be about $1.5 million. The bank created the initial $500,000 with keystrokes, but John has to pay back $1.05 million with after-tax income from his job as an engineer. Multiply this by 130 million households in America, and you see the scope. Total household debt in the U.S. is $17.1 trillion as of 2023. Most of this debt was created through the fractional reserve banking system, ultimately traceable back to Fed money creation. The Fed created money out of thin air, banks multiplied it through fractional reserve lending, and regular people are on the hook to pay it back with real labor, goods, and value. If they can't pay, banks can foreclose homes, repossess cars, garnish wages, and destroy credit scores. Here's who really benefits. The Cantillon effect, named after 18th century economist Richard Cantillon, explains who benefits most from money creation. New money doesn't enter the economy equally. It has specific entry points. Whoever gets new money first can spend it at yesterday's prices before inflation adjusts upward. The Fed's primary dealers, those 24 major financial institutions authorized to trade directly with the Fed, get the new money first. They can immediately invest in stocks, bonds, real estate, and commodities at pre-inflation prices. By the time money filters through the economy and reaches regular people through wages and benefits, prices have already adjusted upward. This explains why asset prices have exploded since 2008, while wages remained stagnant. The S&P 500 increased 400% since 2009. Manhattan real estate prices doubled. Art, classic cars, and collectibles have seen massive price increases. Meanwhile, median household income adjusted for inflation has barely budged. In 2008, median household income was $50,303 in inflation-adjusted dollars. In 2022, it was $70,784 nominal, but only about $52,000 in 2008 purchasing power. Real wages for most Americans have been essentially flat despite massive money creation. The wealth gap exploded accordingly. In 2008, the top 1% owned 23.5% of all U.S. wealth. By 2022, they owned 32.1%. The top 10% now own 69.8% of all wealth. The bottom 50% of Americans own just 2.0% of total wealth, down from 3.7% in 1989. This is not coincidental. It's the direct result of how new money enters the economy through the financial system, rather than through wages or direct payments to citizens. Tesla stock is up 2,000% since 2019. Bitcoin went from $1,000 to $69,000. Luxury real estate markets exploded. The Hamptons median home price is now $2.5 million. Beverly Hills average is $4.2 million. A Manhattan penthouse sold for $250 million. Meanwhile, median rent in major cities doubled. Young people can't afford homes. The first-time homebuyer percentage dropped to historic lows. College graduates are living with parents at the highest rates since the Great Depression. This is the direct result of the Cantillon effect. Asset owners get richer while wage earners get relatively poorer. Even if nominal wages increase, real purchasing power declines. A teacher making $50,000 in 2008 makes $60,000 today, but can afford less with that $60,000 than with $50,000 in 2008. A healthcare worker making $40,000 now makes $48,000, but housing costs doubled, food costs are up 30%, and energy costs are up 40%. The net result is a lower standard of living despite higher nominal income. Meanwhile, someone who owned 100 shares of Apple in 2008, worth $1,500 then, has stock worth over $18,000 today. A 12x return without working, just from holding an asset during a period of money creation. So here's your answer. If the Fed prints money, who do they owe? Nobody in the traditional sense, everybody in the practical sense. The Fed doesn't owe created money to any individual creditor who can demand repayment. The money exists as assets on their balance sheet, backed by $8.9 trillion in government bonds and mortgage-backed securities they purchased with created money. But in the bigger picture, the Fed owes it to every dollar holder to maintain the value of the currency. They owe it to the American people to use this power responsibly. And they're accountable to Congress, who gave them this authority in 1913 and can theoretically revoke it. The Federal Reserve Act can be amended or repealed by Congress. There have been over 200 proposed bills to audit, limit, or abolish the Fed since 1913. Ron Paul's End the Fed movement gained significant traction and led to partial audits that revealed the Fed secretly lent $16 trillion to foreign banks during the 2008 crisis. Here's what this means for you. Every time the Fed creates money, they're essentially diluting the value of every dollar you hold. It's not technically debt, but it's a transfer of purchasing power from dollar holders to wherever new money goes first. The numbers prove this. Since 1913, when the Fed was created, the US dollar has lost about 96% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 in 1913 costs about $26 today. This is not accidental. It's the mathematical result of increasing the money supply faster than economic growth. Banks and financial institutions get new money first and spend it at yesterday's prices. By the time money works through the economy via loans, wages, and consumer spending, prices have adjusted upward, and regular people are paying more for everything. This is why your grandfather could buy a house for $25,000 in 1970 that costs $400,000 today, even though it's the same house. It's why college tuition increased 200% since 1980, far outpacing inflation. It's why healthcare costs exploded. These sectors received massive amounts of easy credit from banks using Fed-created money. Average college debt is now $37,000 compared to $10,000 in 1990. Adjusted for inflation, it should be $20,000 today, but instead it's nearly double. Medical bankruptcy is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States. 70% of bankruptcies have a medical debt component. Housing costs consume 40 to 50% of income for most young adults, compared to 25-30% for previous generations. So while the Fed doesn't owe money to anyone specifically, the cost of creating it is borne by everyone using dollars. It's the most subtle tax ever invented. A tax on holding money, a tax on saving, a tax on fixed incomes. Senior citizens on Social Security see their purchasing power erode annually. Workers see their wages buy less each year unless they get raises that exceed inflation. Savers earn 5% in high-yield savings accounts, while real inflation runs closer to 8%, losing purchasing power despite saving responsibly. The Fed's money creation also enables massive government spending without immediate visible taxation. The federal deficit in fiscal 2023 was $1.7 trillion. Without the Fed's ability to buy government debt with created money, this level of spending would require either massive tax increases or massive borrowing from foreign countries at market rates. Instead, the Fed can buy treasury bonds with created money, allowing the government to spend far beyond tax revenue while spreading the cost across all dollar holders through inflation. It's taxation without representation in the traditional sense. Most people don't vote on Fed policy, yet they pay the inflation tax. The current national debt is $33 trillion. The Fed owns $5.8 trillion of that, purchased with created money. Interest on the national debt is now $640 billion annually, the third largest budget item after Social Security and Medicare, more than defense spending, and rising rapidly as interest rates increase. History shows what happens when central banks create too much money. The German Weimar Republic in the 1920s experienced hyperinflation that destroyed the currency. Wheelbarrows of money to buy a loaf of bread. Zimbabwe in the 2000s saw inflation reach 231 million%, with $100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar bills becoming worthless pieces of paper. Venezuela in the 2010s had inflation peak at 1,000%, with people fleeing the country as their currency became toilet paper. While the U.S. has advantages, the dollar's reserve currency status, the world's largest economy, the strongest military, the laws of economics still apply. The Fed increased the money supply by over 40% since 2020. That money doesn't disappear. It's working its way through the economy, and we're seeing the effects in housing prices, stock valuations, and general inflation that peaked at 9.1% in 2022. Understanding the system lets you make informed decisions about saving versus investing, about debt versus equity, about where to store wealth for the long term. It explains why financial education focuses on assets rather than savings accounts, why the wealthy buy real estate and businesses rather than holding cash. The wealthy understand the game and position accordingly. They buy assets that benefit from money creation. Real estate appreciates with money supply growth. Stocks represent ownership in productive businesses, and commodities like gold and oil hedge against currency debasement. Meanwhile, the middle class keeps money in savings, earning 1/5% interest while inflation runs 608%, a guaranteed losing proposition. The working class borrows money at high interest rates to buy depreciating assets like cars, furniture, and electronics, getting stuck in debt cycles while asset prices rise beyond their reach. The system is designed this way not by accident, but by the mathematical certainty of how money creation works. The game is rigged, but once you know the rules, you can play to win. Drop a comment below. Did this change your thinking about money and inflation? Did you realize how the Fed's creation affects your personal finances? Subscribe for more insights into how the financial system works. Next week, we're covering how commercial banks create money from nothing too, which is even more important than Fed money creation for your personal finances. We'll break down fractional reserve banking, show real bank balance sheets, and explain why understanding bank money creation could be the key to building wealth in an inflationary environment. Hit the notification bell because this rabbit hole goes deep. You'll never think the same about money, debt, or the economy. The system is more complex and more rigged than most people realize, but knowledge is power. Understanding how it works is the first step to making it work for you instead of against you.